Another setting that we can use that impacts the font is the size of it. And we can use the font size property to do that. And notice that it can be a variety of values. If we scroll down here and see the values that are used, there are words that can be the value. So all of these different words. And up here you see an example of using a word, font size large. But then there's also the option to a length or a percentage. And let's talk about the different lengths that are available. So there's a variety of lengths. There's some absolute lengths like centimeter or inch or point, and those are all absolute. Those are often used in print materials and not recommended for use on a screen because screen sizes vary a bunch, and so setting an absolute amount will look very different from one device to another. Now, pixel is listed here in the absolute lengths. It's actually relative to the viewing device and to the resolution. So the size of a pixel depends on the size of the screen and the size of the resolution. So it'll display the pixel based on how big a pixel is on the device. So that really is relative, but it's relative to the device and the resolution. Then there are a bunch of different relative lengths, and here the two we're going to focus on are EM and REM. And here is EM is relative to the font size of the current element. So what it would be relative if it's normally would be a 1 and we put it as a 1.2, then it will be bigger. If we put it at a 0.8, then it would be smaller than what the current font would be. And the REM is relative to the HTML element, so the root element, the highest one. And the tip down here that you see, the tip is that EM and REM units are practical in creating perfectly scalable layout. So as we scale things, and we talk about scaling based on the device. So we take a web page that's on a desktop and we want to show that on a mobile phone. Very different. We want our web pages to be able to scale that big distance from a desktop down to a phone. And so scalable becomes very important as we are using such a variety of devices. We're going to add some font sizes to our web page. And so we're going to use EMs. And what we're going to do first is set the headings. So let's go into the heading styles. And for heading 1s, we want to set the font size to 2.2 EMs. And then for the heading 2, we want that font size to be smaller. So we'll do font size 1.5 EM. And let's go look at how that makes a difference on the web page. So now watch the font, and when we refresh it, specifically watch the font of the headings. When we refresh it, there. So the heading 1s are 2.2 and the heading 2s are 1.5. So it changed the relative size of the H1s and the H2s. Now notice that those are relative to the text that they surround them. So if we say, well, we want our article to be full size, but we want our aside and our nav to be a little bit smaller, then we can also do that. So go down to the aside section, and we can add a rule that aside, and we'll put the font size on aside to be 0.8 EMs. And save that. And then let's go down to I'm going to copy it and take it down to the nav styles. And I'm going to change the nav to be, the selector's nav, NAV, the font size to be 0.8. Okay, now if we save that, now watch things, the heading 1 and heading 2 will be different in the aside and nav because EM is relative. So there, if we refresh it, look how they got smaller. So the font for the regular text got smaller, it's 0.8. But the heading, so we remember that we set the heading 1 for all web pages everywhere, the font size to be 2.2 EM and the font size to be 1.5. These are relative to the surrounding areas. In fact, relative to the font of the parent, right? The font size of the parent. And we changed the font size of the aside to be 0.8. That made this be relative. So the 2.2 was relative to that 0.8. Same with the nav. We set that to be 0.8. And so the heading 1 is relative to that. Now, if we don't want it to be relative to the surrounding text or the parent text, then what we can do is we can use REMs. And if we use REMs, then it's relative, but it's relative and scalable based on the HTML text, what the size of that is in the entire HTML. And so it's not relative to the parent, but it's relative to the HTML. So notice the difference when we use REMs. REMs are always relative based on a single value, that is the value of the font size of the HTML tag. EMs are relative to the parent. So in this case, it's relative to the size of the aside and the size of the nav. So I change it back to EMs, which is what we're going to leave it at. And then we refresh and we see that those heading 1s are relative to the size of the font in the parent.